There is a light that never quite goes out at Royal Lodge. Behind its windows, where Windsor's lawns sink into shadow, one imagines a woman sitting awake, long after the headlines have slept. Sarah Ferguson has always been caught between grace and gravity. She entered the royal story with laughter in her step, a burst of colour in a house that preferred restraint. To the press, she was Fergie, informal, approachable, wonderfully unguarded. For a time, the public adored her openness, until it became too open, too human, too easy to judge. She was the Duchess who turned contrition into conversation. From talk shows to wellness tours, from children's books to podcasts, she rebuilt herself in full view. Her optimism became her armour, gratitude the currency of her survival. And yet, when the cameras cut, what remains? What quiet toll does a life of constant redemption demand? Those close to her say she struggles to sleep, a detail easily dismissed, unless one sees it for what it is. The symptom of a spirit still half awake to the noise of its own past. Perhaps her sleeplessness is not simply physical. Perhaps it is the sound of a conscience that never stopped performing. Because for every public apology, there is a private echo. For every headline of forgiveness, a silent reminder that grace, once traded, is never quite returned. And so the question lingers, not of scandal, but of peace. Can a woman so publicly defined by her mistakes ever truly outgrow them? Or must she live forever between apology and acceptance, between the Crown's mercy and the public's memory? As the rain taps against the glass of Royal Lodge, the camera holds on that single lamp, the one that refuses to go out. Perhaps it burns not from habit, but from hope. A hope that, one night, sleep and silence might finally come. When the storm finally passed, Sarah Ferguson did not disappear into silence. She refused the exile that history had already written for her. Instead, she began again, not as the Duchess of York, but as a woman determined to prove that failure need not be final. In the years after scandal, she rebuilt herself through stories. First for children, then for adults who needed permission to believe again. There were picture books about courage and kindness, documentaries about self-worth, interviews where she spoke of gratitude as if it were a discipline, not a sentiment. Every appearance became an act of penance disguised as purpose. The voice once accused of laughing too loudly now spoke softly of reflection, motherhood, and the wisdom of starting over. Britain began to thaw. The tabloids that once fed on her humiliation started printing words like "come back." Her warmth was genuine. Her mistakes had made her human. In an age where the monarchy often struggled to seem real, Sarah Ferguson's imperfection became her strange advantage. She was no longer the rebel duchess. She was the survivor, still smiling, still trying. But reinvention has its own quiet price. Behind the cameras, money remained tight. Reports hinted at unpaid debts, business ventures that faltered, and an enduring financial dependence on Prince Andrew. Their partnership was an enigma, part friendship, part necessity, bound by history, habit, and shared walls. Royal Lodge, the home they continued to share, stood as both haven and haunting, a place of comfort and confinement. To live under the same roof as the man whose reputation had since darkened the royal brand was both loyalty and limitation. Still, she pressed forward, armed with positivity and self-help prose. She spoke often of service, of finding purpose, as though to remind Britain, and perhaps herself, that redemption could be earned through usefulness. In the monarchy's moral economy, to be useful is to survive. And so she worked, tirelessly, visibly, always performing the role of the forgiven. Yet even resilience can begin to feel rehearsed. The constant need to reassure the public, to smile, to narrate one's own redemption, becomes a subtle exhaustion. Because when forgiveness depends on performance, rest becomes impossible. And so, behind every cheerful interview, there lingered a shadow, a quiet awareness that the applause was conditional. Sarah Ferguson had rebuilt her image, yes, but she was still living inside its scaffolding. A woman admired for her survival, yet never entirely free from the reason she needed to survive at all. The man across the table was no businessman, he was an undercover reporter. The footage spread faster than apology ever could. On the screen, she looked composed, even polite, but beneath that calm was something else entirely. Not corruption, as many assumed, but exhaustion. Behind the charm, there were invoices. They arrived quietly, without ceremony, a reminder that even grace has a running total. Sarah Ferguson's public warmth disguised a life of constant negotiation, not with fame, but with finance. Her pursuit of independence often ended where it began. Independence. The ventures were varied. Lifestyle brands, wellness products, book deals, speaking tours. Each was presented with the language of empowerment, yet each carried the same undercurrent of risk. The promise of self-sufficiency collided with the weight of expectation. For someone once accustomed to royal security, the world beyond the palace walls was not kind to error. Rumours of debt followed her like a shadow that refused to fade. Creditors whispered, tabloids hinted, and even sympathetic friends worried aloud that her trust in others had become her greatest vulnerability. She was generous, often to a fault, loyal to those who advised her, even when advice turned costly. The result was a revolving door of favours and obligations, each one blurring the line between help and dependence. Even friendship, in her world, carried weight. To be close to a duchess, even a fallen one, was to hold currency, and every loan, every introduction, came wrapped in invisible strings. The charm that opened doors could also close them. Then there was Andrew. Their relationship, enduring, affectionate, confounding, remained the axis around which her life quietly turned. He offered protection, a form of continuity that no bank or agent could replicate. And for him, she was an ally when few others remained. To the outside world, their bond seemed oddly suspended between nostalgia and necessity. But as his own controversies deepened, her loyalty began to look less like devotion and more like entanglement. Within Royal Lodge, sanctuary became uneasy ground. The shared walls echoed with unspoken debts, emotional as much as financial. To leave would mean uncertainty. To stay meant complicity in a story no longer her own. Observers noted that her laughter, once spontaneous, had grown careful, calibrated for comfort. In interviews, she spoke of light and positivity, yet behind her eyes there was fatigue. Reports of insomnia returned, those long nights punctuated by restless pacing and tea gone cold. It was as if every decision, every loyalty, carried an aftertaste, the bitterness of having survived too well. She had outlasted scandal and public ridicule, but endurance exacted its own toll. Peace, it seemed, was always postponed, traded again and again for persistence. And in the stillness of Windsor's midnight hours, when the cameras had long gone dark, the true price of survival revealed itself, not in loss, but in the quiet exhaustion of never being allowed to stop trying. There are moments in public life when a single sound can dismantle a reputation. For Sarah Ferguson, it was her own voice, calm, courteous, and caught on camera. In 2010, a sting operation revealed her offering what the world would never forgive: access. The price was clear: £500,000 in exchange for introductions to her former husband, Prince Andrew. A woman cornered by years of financial strain, trying to monetize what little power remained to her. It wasn't greed that spoke that day. It was survival, misread and magnified. She later called it a moment of desperation. But the damage was instant and irrevocable. The headlines were brutal: cash for access, Duchess for sale. What had once been forgiven as clumsy charm was now recast as calculated betrayal. Britain, once indulgent toward her missteps, suddenly lost its patience. The palace reacted with the silence of disassociation. There was no statement of defence, no gesture of compassion, only the discreet retreat of those who had once smiled beside her. Old friends stepped back, courtiers declined comment, and even sympathy became unfashionable. The monarchy had weathered scandal before, but few of its figures had fallen with such public visibility, or such human transparency. Her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, bore the inherited glare. Reporters followed them to charity events, to schools, to royal weddings, always with the same question implied: "Your mother again?" For Sarah Ferguson, the guilt was doubled. She had embarrassed the institution and the children who humanised it. In the footage's aftermath, her openness, once her salvation, became her undoing. She had built a public persona around honesty, spontaneity, accessibility. And now those same qualities were recast as weakness. The smile that once disarmed Britain suddenly looked like denial. The irony was cruel. She had spent years turning shame into strength, only for the same story to repeat. A woman trusting the wrong room, speaking too freely, hoping too much. That evening, cameras lingered on the gates of Royal Lodge as the rain began to fall. Behind them, a light flickered and went out. The scandal was not just financial, it was existential. A duchess who had made transparency her brand had been punished for living it. And as the headlines multiplied, one could almost hear the echo of her earlier laughter. Still brave, still bright, fading beneath the weight of recognition. In Britain's royal theatre, forgiveness rarely grants an encore. After the sting came silence. Not the silence of exile, but of retreat, the kind that follows when words have run out and the world no longer wants to listen. Sarah Ferguson withdrew from the noise. There were no grand statements, no public defences, only the slow reassembly of a private life. In those years, she returned to what had always anchored her: her daughters, her writing, and the steady rhythm of small good things. Children's books, wellness talks, quiet charity work, modest gestures that spoke of someone learning to live without applause. Time, as ever, moved on. Britain, distracted by newer scandals and shifting sympathies, forgot to hate her. And in that quiet forgetting, she found the space to breathe again. The headlines softened, the photographs grew kinder. Her laughter, once weaponised against her, returned without irony. It was as if the nation had rediscovered a kind of weary affection for the Duchess who had endured everything, including itself. But peace for Sarah Ferguson was never unshared. When Prince Andrew faced his own reckoning, the spotlight drifted back toward her, uninvited, unrelenting. She stood by him, quietly, firmly. Not as a duchess, not as a symbol, but as a friend who refused to vanish when others did. Critics saw in it poor judgment. Admirers saw loyalty in its rarest form. Perhaps it was both. Her life seemed to repeat its pattern, defined by the men she forgave, judged by the grace she offered. But something had shifted. There was humility now, not defiance, a tone of acceptance rather than explanation. In interviews, she spoke of gratitude without performance, of aging as atonement, of peace found not through image, but through honesty. Her laughter had softened into something quieter, the sound of someone who has stopped auditioning for forgiveness. Royal Lodge, once the fortress of her survival, had become a sanctuary. The rooms that once echoed with tension now carried the gentler sounds of continuity. Family visits, phone calls, the occasional burst of laughter from her grandchildren. The same walls that once confined her now seemed to protect her. Perhaps after decades of penance disguised as positivity, she had learned to live with her contradictions, to accept that visibility is both gift and ghost, that to remain known is also to remain remembered, for better or worse. And maybe, in that acceptance, came a kind of sleep. Not deep, not dreamless, but peaceful enough to rest. Because endurance, in the end, is its own quiet redemption. Perhaps Sarah Ferguson's greatest act was never her apology. It was her persistence. The quiet insistence on remaining visible when invisibility would have been easier. She continues to move within the royal orbit, not quite inside, not entirely out. A familiar presence at weddings, funerals, and family photographs, always close enough to belong, yet distant enough to remind us that belonging in this family is conditional. Hers is the story of someone who refused to vanish, even when the script demanded her exit. In her, we glimpse the monarchy's most fragile truth. That image can be choreographed, but redemption cannot. It arrives uninvited, inconsistent, unphotogenic. And when it does, it rarely stays for long. Fergie learned that lesson in public again and again. Adored, shamed, forgiven, forgotten, each cycle leaving its trace. Yet somehow, through the blur of decades, she kept smiling, as if grace were a practice, not a performance. In interviews, she speaks of gratitude, with the ease of someone who has rehearsed it into faith. But beneath that optimism lies something more enduring. The understanding that confession in the modern age is both spectacle and survival. She has lived in that contradiction with unusual honesty, trading her mistakes openly, even when it cost her dignity to do so. And perhaps that is why sleep still eludes her. Not from regret, but from remembering. Because when forgiveness becomes public property, it is never truly complete. It must be renewed, quietly, every night in private.